the cloud. Okay, so now I'll go back and share my screen again. And it should be showing up. We're gonna, we'll see if we can make a YouTube video and put this up so others who weren't able to come tonight can see it as well. So this kind of cool picture here, some of you might know where that is. I'm just kind of moving a little strip of folks I can see out of the way here. Any ideas as to where that may be taken? It's on the west coast of the island. Anybody?
Rugged Point.
Say again.
Rugged Point.
Rugged Point. Good guess. Good guess. It is a rugged point for sure, but it's not the rugged point.
Okay.
This is what you're looking at in the foreground is Heater Point, and in the background, the big distant point is what's it called? Cape Cook Point, maybe. It's at the north end of the Brooks Peninsula, and that little island sitting offshore is Solander Island. So I show this because this is a legendarily bad weather place. There is a lot of activity in the big bay that you see in front of you because it's on the north side of a huge peninsula on the west coast of the island. And so it's great to be able to, have some good sort of tools to understand what you might be facing in the sea state if you're out here. But I immediately want to say that it's not about paddling. This isn't really about paddling on the west coast in some, high energy expedition place. It's about paddling anywhere. And what I'd mostly like to leave you with are some tools that you can use any day to paddle right here in Victoria. So this is just a nice picture, but it sort of makes the point that it's needed everywhere. I'm just going to admit somebody else here. Okay. And then if I can get back to, there we go. So where do you start trying to figure stuff out for understanding what you're going to face out there in the ocean? And I think I would be on firm ground in recommending to you, if you're not already, familiar with the Canadian tides and currents. And by the way, I'm going to get around to the wind and weather, but this is kind of the basis of the sea state, is to understand tides and currents. So as you see here, I'm not going to read this out, but just talk to it. And that these things are created by Environment Canada. They aren't printed anymore. They used to print them and you had to pay for them, but now they're online. And the one that we are most interested in is right here, volume 5. And this is the 2022 version, which I've downloaded and so can you. It covers tides and currents in our area. So here's volume 5, the cover of it, I guess. It's really the official resource for determining what the tides and currents are in the area on the West BC's coast. So very important official publication. In addition, some really good information here that's made available to you. Here's just a shot of one of the early pages, which gives you an idea of how the Environment Canada sort of breaks things up. So you can see the legend here. The reference ports for tide stations are the dark circles, and the reference ports for current stations are the squares. So you'll see the squares are in particular places. This, for instance, is race. Whoops, I'll go back if I can. Race Passage, Race Rocks, Race Passage, Active Pass. But you can see there are other current stations that are important as well. And then more tide stations exist than this as well, but the black circles are the tides. And a way to get a quick check for what the daily tidal pattern is in this area is to look at Victoria, because as you can see, this is kind of the area we operate in, I guess you'd say, right in here. And Victoria, the city of Victoria, its tide station is roughly in the center of that. And the currents at Race Passage are the basis for many of the currents subsequent currents that you can calculate. So it's a good thing to check as well. So that's a quick way to do it. And we'll do that a bit later. Just going to try and move this around here. We have, this is a shot of the page for Victoria's tides. This is the numeric shot that you would be seeing if you went into the book and looked up where we are today, which is November the 7th, I guess. So right here, we're seeing the Victoria tides, and you can see you've got the day, the time, meters and feet. So you're going to go in any given day. Here we are in the 7th from a high tide, which is in the middle of the night, I guess, our night, dropping, then rising, then dropping. So we have what they call a diurnal tide pattern here with 2 highs and 2 lows each day. And this is the source for that. So it's got 4 pages covering the 12 months for 2022. They also helpfully have a graphic which gives you the same thing in a kind of a visual sense for, I guess this is October that I picked up. So you can see how each day has been pictured. Here's the 2nd through to the 29th. You can see 31st of October, and the ups and the downs are kind of graphically portrayed. So you see sometimes it goes way down, way up. Sometimes it's just a little drop. Sometimes it seems like there's really kind of hardly any midday drop, but it may pause slightly. So there's a lot of variation, and that will affect, it will show its effect in currents and ultimately in the sea state as well. And in terms of the currents, we have, and again, if you're very familiar with this, that's fine. If not, and it seems a bit weird, you'll get used to looking at this, and you should. Here's November 7th again. So we have, in this case, the day, the time. And what we're first getting are the turn. The turn of the tide would be from ebb to flood, or from flood to ebb. And then the maximum of whatever it is. So if we look here, we can see at 3:45 in the morning, I guess this morning, it switched over to, that would be an ebb, because we're getting a maximum ebb of minus 4.1 knots at 7:10 in the morning. And then at 10 o'clock in the morning, you get the turn to a flood until about just before 1 here, and it gets up to 3.3 knots as the maximum at that time. And then it's dropping down and eventually ebbing again. So that's the current pattern at Race Rocks. And you would want to have some sense of how that relates to perhaps a typical, but you can almost look at the numbers here and see, and Race Rocks is a high current area. So you can see here, or just after midnight, it was up at a very high flood, close to 6 knots. The daytime ebb is not that much, but that's a significant ebb, 4 knots. If you think about what you paddled, which is probably 2 or 3 knots, you're not going to make much headway against a maximum of 4 or more knots. So it's something to bear in mind. And then, of course, as we'll see later, the current interacts with any wind that's going on. So that's the Race Rocks current. And you have tide and current apps as well now. So getting a little distracted by my little thing here. Environment Canada has the information I've just shown you, but there are lots of others. Here's a couple. And by the way, I have a resource sheet, which I've tried to send in the chat, but I'll do it later as well, now that you're all on, which has all of this sort of website information in it with live links. So you don't necessarily have to record them, but and take your, sort of try to jot it down. It'll be in the page I give out. www Tide and Current Predictor is right here. And I'll maybe just see if I can get to that. There it is. That's what that looks like. It's a worldwide tide and current predictor. It comes out of an American university site. And I use this, you can get to understand how it works. Takes some time to sort of find your way around efficiently, but all the information is there, let's just say. So we can close out of that. And then Tides Chart is an app for your phone. that you can find easily enough and gives you more of a graphic, but it probably gives you the detail as well. This is showing Clover Point here, tide times for the 7th and 8th of November. So that's tides chart, and tides near me, whoops, golly. Tides near me is this app, and it has a little bit of a map where you can see the areas that they're going to suggest that you might want to consider the tides. So a lot of these are not, none of them are made for kayakers per se. They're made for boaters, usually fishermen, sailboaters. And so we use these things, but sometimes they're not really optimized for the places we paddle, which is quite close to the shore generally. And so, just bear that in mind. So tide and current apps, and as you're getting familiar with that, the other thing about tides and currents is you may have heard of the Current Atlas. Current Atlas, very interesting volume, which again, I think you can maybe still buy as a printed thing, but they have it online as well now. It's quite a big volume. I was going to actually bring mine to the computer here, but I forgot it. Anyway, it looks like this, and you can see it's 220 pages. So way too big to generally for people to print out, but you could look at it. It gives you a lot of detail. I'm going to come down here to a page to show you. Yeah, this would be a standard page that shows you by directional arrows and by the thickness.
Alan, we can't see anything, or I can't anyway.
Oh, you can't.
No,
Okay.
no, we can't see.
Opening on the screen, Alan.
It's not opening on the screen. Okay, let me see if I can figure out how to do that. I'll move this around.
And when you're finished, I also sent you a message about flood and ebb, about
Okay.
explaining it again way slower. I'm assuming, yeah, I hope I'm not the only one who didn't understand what you said.
That's good. All right, thank you. All right, I'm not gonna waste the time to try to figure out how to change my screen here, I think, unless it's easily done. I'll try that. I'll try one thing. Stop the share and go here. And no, that's not going to work out very well for me. Okay. So we'll come back in here. Let me just pick up. You can see that, I think, the page saying Current Atlas at the top. It's just you can't see the Current Atlas. And Susanna, so you wanted to explain the flood and ebb slower. I can do that. Let's just back up a bit. Oops, cancel that. Okay. So I'll just say something about the flood. So when the water floods on the West Coast, it comes in, I think you should be able to see my cursor here, comes in from the west, enters the Strait of Juan de Fuca nearest Victoria, and floods all the way up here. It turns out it floods all the way up to around Campbell River, because at the same time, the water is coming around the top of Vancouver Island and down the north end of the island, and they meet somewhere in here. But for our purposes here in Victoria, the flood is coming from the west, and then it curves up to the north, and the ebb the opposite way. So if you come to the pages where I was talking about ebbs and the tides, rather, the high tide and the low tide are the levels of the water above a reference point that are established when the tide reaches its maximum for that period, and then it ebbs and it reaches a minimum or the low tide. So that's the tide level, which usually call the tide, and the current.
Right. It was this piece here that.
Okay, this piece
here.
So
yeah, I didn't understand how to read it.
Okay. So here in November the 7th, If you just look at the top here, the first two things relate to turns and the second two to maximums. So the turns for Monday the 7th, there are turns in the current at 3:45 in the morning, 10:03, 14:52, and 22:15 it turns. And then if you go over to the next one and you see what the maximum is, it's obvious which way it has turned because it's turning at 3:45 and then 3 hours later or so, 3.5 hours later, it reaches a maximum of minus 4.1. Minus is an ebb value. And then it's going to slow down. That ebb value is going to slow down and it's going to from 7:10. And at 10:03, it's going to turn to a flood or to a positive value. So at 10:03, it turns to a flood. But by 12:44, it's reached the maximum flood, which in this case is 3.3 knots positive. And then it'll slow down from that until 14:52 or just before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then it turns once again to an ebb. And this is a bit of a stronger ebb. So that's how you read that, that table.
And what does the positive and negative mean? Sorry, I don't.
Positive is flood, negative is.
Oh. Okay.
Okay. And those are in, the values are in knots, which are nautical miles per hour.
Yeah, got that. I know that. I just didn't. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay. So we've given up on Environment Canada's. What I'll just say about the current atlas is that they've gone to the trouble of creating an atlas as sort of a visual representation you can find online, and that and it shows you the direction with little arrows and strengths of those arrows. And then you need, in order to know which of the many pages apply to your day, you can go to certain tables. There are some that are sold, the Murray's tables. I can't remember the other name of the commercial one, but there's also a, one more. Yeah, Borsboom is a fellow who has put them together for free, and they can be found online as well. And in fact, there's a Tiny Octopus, funny name for it, but is an app that you can get on your phone. They charge for that, but it shows you the day by day, the same thing that you would get in the printed version. So those are all about a sort of a visual representation of the current, which might help you to visualize it in different areas, but you can get that same information by looking at those tables, even though they're a bit harder to, your mind doesn't take it in quite as well as arrows on a page, I think. So I'm going to move on from the current atlas because I wanted to talk in this workshop more about wind forecast sites. So, but you'll see later why I've spent the time to talk about tides and currents, because no matter what the wind is doing, the tides and currents are always doing something. So whatever you find out about the wind, the tides and currents will have an effect on that. So these are my favorite wind forecast sites or apps. One is, and I'd say this is the basic one again, Environment Canada. They have a site, Marine Weather for Pacific South Coast. If you're out on a trip and you don't have cell service, obviously you don't have Wi-Fi connection or a computer or anything, you can always listen to Coast Guard Weather Radio, and they have a continuous marine broadcast, and the channel that they broadcast on, which you can pick up on a VHF radio, changes depending on where you are, but it's always available to you out there, and they just keep going 24/7. They run through their weather radio report, and then it changes 4 times a day, and they'll give you the update. So Environment Canada is the basic one. Then these are the ones that I tend to consult: Predict Wind, Wind Alert, which is also known as Sail Flow, Windy, Wind Finder, Big Wave Dave. It's a local guy. He's a windsurfer. So windsurfers, they're pretty close to shore. So that's kind of good, because on the other hand, they like a lot of wind. We tend not to like very much the big winds. And then Spot WX. So those are the ones that I typically look at. And I think I begin to show you here something from each of these sources. So I mentioned Environment Canada, and this is Environment Canada's, complicated URL there, but here's some basic information that is available to you at that site is how they organize the coastline for weather forecasting. So we're way down here where I've moved my cursor, and you can see that they are covering the entire west coast of Canada from Environment Canada's Coast Guard weather radio, and they divide it into these sections. The West Coast, Vancouver Island South, North. Explorer is really an automated buoy out here. This is the Bowie buoy up in this area, Haida Gwaii, Hecate Strait, and so on. Down in the area where we are, it's rather more complicated, and they have another chart showing that. So here's the Victoria area, and they divide Juan de Fuca Strait, which is a huge body of water, as we know, that comes more or less straight in from the west. And most of our weather, of course, comes in that way. It is divided into Juan de Fuca West entrance, Juan de Fuca Central here, and Juan de Fuca East entrance, or east here. The dividing line between Juan de Fuca East and Harrow Strait, which runs to the north, actually goes right through Discovery Island off Oak Bay. And then we have Harrow Strait, and then Georgia Strait South, and Georgia Strait North, and so on. But the ones that we're mostly concerned with are pretty much right in this area here. So Juan de Fuca Central, East, and Harrow Strait. And Environment Canada will give weather forecasts for each of those areas, as you'll see. Now I'm wondering if I have this information on the page that I mentioned. I'll just see if this is gonna, but I feel like it won't come up since I didn't last time. Tell me if it does. Does that show up?
Nope.
No. Okay. So if you go to their site, you will see their sort of page, which explains very well kind of what that Marine Weather Pacific covers. And this is sort of what it looks like graphically, which is handy to give you a quick and dirty. The blue is pretty good, no warning or watch. The red is a warning. You can see there's advisories and watches, but normally this is split between red and blue. And in this case, I've taken these a few days ago. We have most of the area offshore is no warnings, but there are warnings in the straits near us, except for the area right here, which shows no warning at the present time. So this area that's showing no warning, by the way, is probably Harrow Strait, which tends to have a little bit of protection from the other straits that are more kind of northwest, southeast oriented. So that's Environment Canada's graphic. This is what predict wind looks like. You have, in this case, a sort of an active graphic that gives you an idea of the weather, or pardon me, the winds, and the winds that are a stronger color. Naturally, red is strongest, yellow, then green, then blue is the lightest winds. And you can see we've got lighter winds over the landmass. The wind tends to gather speed on the water, then drop it over the land and come up again as it races over the water without any obstruction. So that's predict wind. And of course, they also have a whole range of things, which we'll be able to maybe take a look at later. Wind alert, also known as, no, wind alert is the same as sail flow, but it has a graphic showing you the places too, and it shows the areas that they're forecasting for with these little icons, wind icons, and they're showing what it was at the time that I picked this up. Windy, similar.
Can I ask sorry to interrupt, Alan, can I ask a question about those little arrows?
Yeah.
Does that mean the wind, so for example, yeah, so the little arrow means that where the point, so the wind is coming, obvious, I know this seems like a stupid question, but the wind is coming from the back of the arrow, is that correct?
That's right, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, so the point is where the wind is going, so it's come from the back. And so this wind, because all of these diagrams, just like a chart that you would have, a marine chart, oriented so that north is at the top, south at the bottom, west on the left, and east on the right. So you can see that this is kind of mostly coming from the east, maybe a bit to the north of east.
Thank you.
And so you would have a prediction there of an east northeast kind of wind, but it's zero. There's not much happening at all. Very little wind that they're showing here.
So when it has the green arrows on this particular chart, you've got mostly wind coming from the north, but it doesn't have a little number behind it. So how would one know how much wind from that?
So if you were in this app, you would click on any of these and it would show you another set of numbers, which told you much more about it. These are really, the reason why they're green is probably because these are land-based weather stations, and the white are marine-based weather stations. I think that's all that is. They relate more to the place that the forecast is being made from. This is probably Gonzales Observatory here, and this may be, it's near you, Vic, isn't it? So it's something in the Gordon Head area.
Thank you.
So that's all that means. So don't read too much into just that, the direction right there, and try and move on. So in this case, this is just the way that it looks if you were to pull up windy. And by the way, all these apps you can go to find on your computer or on your phone. You don't have to pay for them to use them in a very limited way, which is enough to get, wind forecasts. What they will want, obviously want you to pay them, but that just gives you more details, and more details I'd suggest than you probably need. So I wouldn't pay for any of these if I were you until you get to a point where you feel, you really like this one and you're willing to pay something for it, because they're going to charge you, $20 for a year or something like that. And there's no point in doing that if you can just get it for nothing. So again, here they're showing you the wind direction. It's got a tail down here. So this wind is coming from the southeast a little bit, the way this graphic shows it, but that's the way windy does. Wind Finder is another one that I like to use. It has this kind of display where it has others, but this is the display I use where it shows for hours during the day what the wind forecast is. This is at Discovery Island. It's showing on, in this case, March 21st, that it's wind is 8, gusting 12 at 8 in the morning, and it stays pretty low, a little bit lower than that as the day goes along. And this arrow is showing you the wind direction. So it's mostly from the southeast, and then it turns around here later in the day to the west, and then around again. So, wind is not a constant thing. It's very dynamic, and we're just trying to get an overall sense when we are consulting these things of what it's likely to do, but what we experience may be different again, of course. Wind Finder, what did I just say? That was windy. This is Wind Finder. Oh, a Big Wave Dave. Big Wave Dave is a different type of site again. He just sort of shows predictions for certain areas where, wind surfers like to go. Dallas Road, this is around Clover Point. Gordon's Beach out in Souk, Island View, Willows Beach. And so some of these places are places where we also like to go. And in that case, we can look at the predictions that he's making, and he has a couple of different models that he uses, and just build that into our thinking about what's going to happen. So Big Wave Dave, whoops, I've got a quick finger here. And then Spot WX is the last one I'll mention. And what happens is you kind of find a place, and you press your mouse key, and it pops up like that, and that's the place that you are making your forecast. And then it finds observatories and wind forecasts in that area, and will give them to you in different ways. So Spot WX. So I tried to use the same area just so you could see how the differences looked, and these are all off Oak Bay in this case. I also wanted to mention that in addition to tides and currents, wind, we also have swell. We don't have swell much in Victoria because we're some distance from the big ocean. We've got a lot of protection here. So mostly swell is something you'll experience on the West Coast, but in fact, pardon, we do get swell, which is generated by having, big storms over long periods of time, sometimes a long distance away, out in the deep ocean, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean or something, and then a day or two later, these swells will come rolling into the west coast of the island, and some of them will make their way up the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So these are swell forecast sites, which we tend not to consult, but surfers, kayak surfers and other surfers do, Magic Seaweed, Surf Forecast, and Surfline. And what they do is, I think I may show them here, yeah. So they give you an estimate of how big the swell is, 1 to 2 feet, not so big. So these are quite low swells that are being predicted here. They probably aren't very interested in those. They're hoping for, something more, but that's how they display it. This is a site called Surf Forecast. So you can see they're showing how these figures are, I think, in feet. I'm not sure entirely, but because it's an American site, so probably in feet. And these are showing them offshore, and then they get lower as they come into shore, but they can also rise as they come closer in up some of these inlets. So Surf Forecast, and Surfline is the third one. Vancouver Island Regional Surf Forecast kind of looks like that. And so the size of the swell, the big slow waves out there on the ocean go up and down during the day, and something to bear in mind. I'll just say that in terms of these surf things, we tend not to take it into account around here. But if we have strong, consistent winds over a reasonable sort of reach, it's called, extent area over the water, they can produce swells here in the Victoria area as well. And I was somewhat surprised by that, along with some others, as we went out of Telegraph Cove, which you may know, the other side of Cadborough Bay, which faces east. And there had been a lot of wind coming from the east. Sort of east of there is San Juan Island, Orcas Island, and so on. And so it's about, I guess, 5 or 8 miles across, but have been blowing quite strongly, 15 to 20 knots all night. And it was no longer windy like that. But in fact, the swell was coming in quite strongly. And so we decided not to paddle that day because the swell was too great. And we hardly had seen swell before there. So something to bear in mind, if there's been a lot of wind, there could be a residual swell even around Victoria. I also want to plug these things because these are great resources as well. We have great paddle planning sites. So if you're interested in paddle planning and you're starting to educate yourself, then here's some things which places you should consult. West Coast Dave, it's called, which is Siska has a membership coordinator and a webmaster by the name of Dave Ostapovich. He goes by the handle Dave-O because it's a long last name. And so he has just out of the goodness of his heart, he's put together a paddle planning website, and he's now expanded it to the whole island. And it's called West Coast Dave. So if you Google that, you'll see that. BC Marine Trails, if you don't know about that, definitely something you should look into. They have an online interactive map, which you can use, and it's really handy. You can measure things, you can zoom in and out, you can see where campsites and launch sites and so on are, and plan your day paddles as well as camping trips. And then, and this does cost something, the Navionics boating app is quite sophisticated. This is used by sailors and motor boat operators as well as kayakers, but it's really quite a comprehensive trip planner on the marine environment. And Navionics includes really pretty good marine charts. They're not exactly the same as the Environment Canada marine charts that we buy, but they're pretty good, and you can zoom in and out and sort of see things on your phone, as one of my friends does very well, or on your computer at home or whatever. So a good resource as well. So we have some great paddle planning sites available to us. This is what Dave O's site looks like. And you can see just from the tabs that he's got a lot of information in here, and you can follow each of those down. BC Marine Trails, I mentioned the interactive map, and you can see how this is the whole coastline. They've shown a whole range of things from where you can stop to have a picnic, to launch, to camp, and so on. And it gets very crowded down here in the South Island because there's so many things in our area. And this gives you just a bigger version of that, so you can see just how many there are. They're literally everywhere down in our area. And did I skip one? No, I guess not. Oh, gosh, I think I should try this other button rather than the wheel. So here's my suggestion for those of you who haven't done this already, that practice. So if you plan paddles regularly, you will build your skills at understanding what is going on and then actually seeing how that works out when you get out on the water with your friends and see how your projections, your forecasts worked. So get together with a few fellow paddlers or come on a Siska paddle. Kayak, I'd say each week. It's a good idea to get into a good regular practice like that, and something that you do more frequently will stick with you. If you have a group of friends or you're with others regularly, it's good to take turns planning, or if you're not responsible for planning, kind of pretend you are and go through the motions as if you were trying to plan it and trying to understand where the winds are and where the tides and currents are and so on. And you'll learn by doing. And then I thought I would give an example of planning a day paddle just to give you an idea about that. So if we were to plan a paddle for tomorrow, I thought about this a few days ago, by the way, before it started to snow, but I go paddling every week. I paddle on Wednesday and Thursday every week all year long, unless I'm out on a trip or something. So if you were planning a paddle for tomorrow, and I'd suggested before that you look at the currents at Race Passage and tides at Victoria to get a rough idea about what's going on. That's a good place to start. You'll get a sense of what that current pattern is, when it's coming in, when it's going out, and what the tides are. Are they really high, or do they tend to be lower at certain times when you're going to be there? I wrote these notes down, or I pasted them here on the bottom, because these are things that you may not immediately tweak to. This is from the Environment Canada book as well. It says the mariner should be aware that slack water, that is when the current has stopped going one way and starts to go another, and high or low tide are not necessarily coincident. So they aren't at the same time. Basically, slack water can occur in some areas at quite a different time than the high tide if it's turning to ebb, let's say, or then the low tide if it's turning to flood. And you wonder, why on earth is that? Why can't it sort of get it together, do these things at the same time? And it has to do with the shape of the bottom, the shape of the undersea floor, and also on the way that the water moves as it comes in and or goes out of our area. So, the water looks like more or less a flat surface out there with its sea state on top. But of course, if we were able to see, if we had sonar built in or something, we would see canyons, we would see, seamounts, we would see shelves under the ocean. We just see the tops of these sometimes when they come awash, when the tide lowers so much that now we see, oh, there's a rocky shelf out there, better avoid that. But in fact, a lot of these things are out there, especially near the shore where we are. They're not very far underwater, and that might change the timing by which the water comes and goes in the area that you're paddling. There's some areas we might get into that later where this is really evident and it's worth knowing about, and you'll learn that as you go along. And the other item is that when you're using daylight saving time, so we're not doing that anymore, we've just switched over to standard time. But the tables that I showed you and all of the times that are listed in those tables are always on standard time. So if you are in a place like ours where you're actually at the time that you're planning your paddle using daylight saving time, you have to add an hour to whatever time shows up in the table there from Environment Canada. And that's one reason why I think people like apps, because most of these apps will do that for you. They will recognize where you are geographically by your phone location or whatever. And the tide times that are shown to you usually should say they've been adjusted to show the time that your area is on. So right now we're all on standard time. And so the numbers showing in the tables and the numbers that come up in the apps will be the same. But those are just a couple of notes. So if we're going to plan a paddle for tomorrow, and that's Tuesday, November the 8th, I pulled these figures out of the tables, which I showed you earlier. And we talked about some of them. So you can see here that the current at Race Passage, we did discuss this, that we have a turn at 4 in the morning, then again around 11, and finally about 3. And so we're moving at from 4 in the morning, it's beginning to ebb, and it maxes at just before 8. And then by 11, it's stopped and it's moving to a flood. And by 1:20, it's up to a maximum flood of 3 knots. And then it slows down and turns again to an ebb at about 3. So the pattern here, if you like to think about the time that we paddle, which is usually about 10 o'clock to 3 o'clock, that we're going to be, if we're out there and we're relating to the Race Passage current, we're going to see a sort of a turn around 11. So it will have the end of an ebb, then it will turn to a flood, and the flood will go on until 3. So a little bit of an ebb followed by a flood, and this flood maximum is about 3 knots, which is, not as high as it was overnight, but it's a significant figure. So you don't want to be paddling against it if you don't have to. So something to bear in mind for your planning. And then the Victoria tides, or the tides, high tide and low tide experienced at the Victoria station. You can see that at 9:15 in the morning, I'm still on feet for tides. It's about a 6-foot tide. It goes up to 8.6 and then way down, but that's not till about 10 o'clock at night. So during the time we paddle, basically, it's going from around 6 feet in height up to 8.6 feet. Now, right here, you can see, although we are talking
could you
about...
just very brief, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Somebody had a question there? No? Okay. We did talk about this, and this is for Victoria, City of Victoria. It's actually Victoria Harbor. And this is Race Passage, the Race Rocks that are off Rocky Point out in Machosen Way. So they are different geographical locations, but I'd like you to just pay attention to the fact that we have here showing the tides. It's going from a low around 9 to a high around 3. This is our paddling time. So you think, oh yeah, well, it's probably just flooding then, right? It's going up about 2.5 feet over a period of about 5.5 hours. Not so hard to understand that. But if you look back here, you can see it's actually a little bit more complicated at Race Passage. And so probably the currents might be doing something a little bit different. There's a bit of an ebb to begin, even though the time is overlapping here, and then it turns to a flood. And the flood goes on here until about 3:20. So just something to bear in mind. And I think the best way to understand this is that you shouldn't be too surprised if you think it's going to be flooding all the time you're out there, or ebbing or whatever, if you meet some current that's going the other way, because in fact, the tides and currents around here are relatively complicated because of all of the obstructions, the islands, the undersea shape of the undersea floor and so on that exists. It's not straightforward. But those are the basics. We have kind of a rough idea that it's a little bit of an ebb, then followed by a flood, and the tide is rising in Victoria. So I've tried to summarize that here. Got a morning flood, and then it got a late afternoon ebb. And the tide remains fairly high. And so if that's the basis for you to think about paddling, then you start thinking, well, what about the wind? And I always start with Environment Canada. So if that slide I showed you before, if you were to go to Environment Canada, you would find, this was again a few days ago, it may have changed, but it still sounds pretty windy outside. that in Harrow Strait, the wind is expected to be northeast, 15 to 25 knots. And in Juan de Fuca, the wind easterly, 10 to 20 knots. Now, just in case people aren't aware, it gives you this range. What this usually means is that the first figure is what's called the base wind, or the consistently blowing wind. If you like, think about it as a floor, a sort of a minimum of wind that you can expect. And then there are gusts that occur. And sometimes when you're on the water, you can see wind cells, gusts coming. You can see the pattern of the water as it moves across, and you'll feel it hit you and it moves along. So sometimes the gusts can be substantially more than the base wind. In this case, 15, but gusting 25. Well, 15 is strong, but 25 is very strong. So again, here you've got base wind of 10 and gusting to 20. And so those are significant winds worth paying attention to for sure. And here I just want to stop, and I'll take the share off in a minute and have a bit of a conversation here. But here's the graphic of, and we have it in our heads anyway, but this is our area just taken from one of the map apps I have here. And so the Saanich Peninsula is oriented more or less north-south. If you're talking about Victoria, you can see it's on the southern shore here. Oak Bay is kind of on the eastern shore, and we have this shoreline of the Saanich Peninsula going up. We have a shoreline going out the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which has various points protecting it, but mostly is going out to the west. And we have Saanich Inlet, which is, again, pretty much a north-south inlet, but it's as you know, it's a steeply sided fjord. And so it has, it's kind of protected in its lowest part, certainly, and even up here from a lot of winds. And to the north of us, Salt Spring and some of the other islands provide some windbreaks, I guess you'd say, to the Saanich Peninsula and the west shore areas of Victoria. So bear that in mind. And if you can remember the wind forecast we just had, I'll just go back to that. Northeast in Harrow Strait, so kind of coming down, and easterly in Juan de Fuca, if I was to come back here. So northeast would be this direction, and easterly in Juan de Fuca would be this direction. So going from the east, it would be blowing this direction. So I'm going to just stop the share, if I can move this around a bit. And stop. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to just invite you to consider now, what do you think would be, based on those the wind forecasts in the main straits, what would be an area that you might consider planning a paddle for tomorrow? Any thoughts?
Saanich Inlet.
Saanich Inlet. Okay. Yeah. Good point. It is protected, as I mentioned. We have a northeast wind in Harrow Strait, so it will invade Saanich Inlet, and it does have, in Saanich Inlet is quite a long inlet, so when wind gets in there, it can move quite quickly. But if you were careful about going to where you were going in Saanich Inlet, yes, I think that's a good suggestion. Any other suggestions? We've got an east wind and an east wind.
I'm just wondering if it's a one-way or a two-way paddle.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. I like to do one-way paddles, and I see Tim's on here. We were on a one-way paddle last week that went around the top of the peninsula. So we started at Tulista and went up and around past the ferries and stuff, and down to Pat Bay. And so we were doing that because it was an all-day flood, and we were getting a flood helping us all the way. But in fact, we also knew that there was a southeast wind. And so if you do a paddle plan like we did last week, and you turn back, your route turns back on itself,
Yeah.
you can run straight into the wind, which we eventually did, right,
Yeah.
Tim? Yeah. Yeah, so it was some active paddling as we ended the thing, but it wasn't too bad. But and we knew we were going to have that. But that's a good point. Bear in mind, if you need to do a circuit, you might have to come back. And if you can do a one-way, which then means kind of having a ride at each end or something, then you might be able to avoid things a bit better. So Saanich Inlet, good suggestion. Any other suggestions for locations?
I'm thinking East Souk area.
East Souk?
I'm thinking, I'm not 100% sure. I'm just looking at the map and trying to figure out if the wind is coming off the land from the northeast, then East Souk is somewhat protected.
It is. But in East Souk, you're on the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the
Right.
wind forecast there was for easterlies,
Oh, okay.
10 to 20. So they might come right in on you. 10 to 20 isn't as bad as 15 to 25, but it's still a significant wind. But you're on the right. I think you've got a good idea there. I think it's Linda, right? If you're thinking
Yeah.
about East Souk, I see Barry's on the call there, and
Well,
Barry
not
lives-
necessarily East Souk, but just looking at
yeah.
if the wind is coming off the land out onto the water, then it's protected. And so those areas would be the areas that one would choose to paddle. But this hour of the night, my brain and my structure, the function doesn't work 100%.
So Barry, you live on Souk Basin.
Yes, I do, Alan. Yeah.
That's
So,
his place.
yeah, the Souk Basin would be a good place to paddle, I would think. It's quite sheltered from the northeast and the easterly winds, especially on the south end of the Souk Basin, close to where I am. Yeah, so I would be comfortable paddling there in the forecast tomorrow.
Yeah. Okay, so Souk Basin. Another thing I'll just throw out is Esquimalt Harbor. I don't know if we have anybody who lives in that part of town on the line here, but Esquimalt Harbor, quite well protected from the northerly wind. If I go back to sharing my screen here, and you can just see that map again. Yeah, this is Esquimalt Harbor right here. I'm circling. So you can see it's got some protection and from the east and from the northeast. So you can get in there. The thing is that you then have to think about where you would launch. We tend to launch along here, which might not be quite as protected, but once you get into the harbor, probably some good protection there. We were just talking about Souk Basin. This is the area that Barry was referring to right in here.
Mm.
And, Linda mentioned East Souk, and this is the East Souk Peninsula. So you're quite right, Linda, that there is protection from the east and certainly from the northeast here. And you might find that this area along here is fine too. And then Saanich Inlet, if we look at the map here, you're going to see, so Saanich Inlet, if there was a strong northeasterly, it might kind of come in this way. So it might be a good idea to stay over on this. This is Pat Bay, and you could come out here maybe into Coles Bay, but if you got out here and there was too much wind, you could always paddle back again. Or if you were in southern Saanich Inlet around Brentwood Bay, you could see what it was like in the bay itself, which is usually protected. We usually take a look once we get out to Willis Point, which is about here, because this area, which is called Squally Reach, is called that for a reason. It picks up a lot more wind. And so with the forecasts, I'm guessing that there would be quite a bit of wind there tomorrow. But those are all good suggestions. I'm just gonna
the other area, Alan, if it's really windy and protected, is just the gorge and the Portage Inlet area.
Yes. Oh, yes. Thank you for that. Yeah, quite right. So this is the gorge, and this little diagram here comes out into Portage Inlet. And if you've not done it, it's a great trip to do the circuit, as they say. You come in here, then there's a little portage about 1 kilometer across, and you get to Esquimalt Harbor, and then you come out here and back in. If you started in Victoria Harbor, back here, wherever you started, you just have to be careful with that long trip about the Tillicum Narrows and what's happening with the current there. But it's very protected, as you say. If you were just doing a little paddle in this area, I'm sure you could easily avoid strong winds by staying within this narrow channel, because it's in the middle of a land sort of barrier that's going to protect it for a lot. So let's see if I can come forward. Oh yeah, so then I wanted to say something about these wind apps that I'm recommending. And we've got wind app forecasts for areas, and we've talked about the areas. These were the ones that I had thought about, the ones that you've all mentioned now, with the most shelter and pullouts. That is, if things go awry, you want to be able to get off the water quickly. And each of those areas we discussed have those things. These are the areas that I had identified for myself. And then I did pull up for each of the areas other than Gorge Waterway, which really there's no good wind forecasts for anyway, because it's such a small area. These are the wind forecasts I found for those areas. So now that you see the wind forecasts from these apps that I looked at, what do you think about that?
Well.
They look a bit daunting, don't they?
Yeah, and different.
And different.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so I want to say a couple of things about this. One is that, again, you want to consider, is this consistent with what you were getting from Environment Canada, which is the official data source? By the way, all these apps use the same data that the government produces, but then they have a proprietary kind of algorithms that produce forecasts, and they do it in a very sort of complicated way. So they are worth looking at, but they're using the same data. I would say these sort of values that we're seeing are more northeast than east. So Esquimalt Harbor, Saanich Inlet, and Suit Basin are all showing some kind of north or northeast. So there's nothing much here about easterly in these forecasts. And then the base winds even are fairly significant. 20 is a very big wind. I personally wouldn't paddle knowingly, wouldn't begin to paddle in a 20 knot wind. Sometimes you get caught in that wind and then you try to get out of it, but it's too strong for comfortable paddling in my view. So that's mostly what we see. 10 knots is pretty good. 15 is manageable with my skill level, but these are quite large values. So that would give me pause. And if I was thinking about a paddle tomorrow, which I'm not, by the way, you would want to really think carefully about where you went. The local knowledge like Barry has, for instance, in Suit Basin, would allow him to interpret these figures much more carefully than somebody who doesn't know the area. And I want to draw attention to the great discrepancy that there is in some of these between the base wind value and the gust values. So you can see here, typically it's maybe 5 knots difference or 10 knots difference between the base and the gust wind values on forecasts, but some of these are 20 or 30 knot differences. And why is that? Well, in my experience, it means they don't really know. There isn't good predictive information that their algorithm is able to use to determine really what's going to happen. So they're giving you a wide spread, out of, I guess, hitting the possibilities here. Having said that, even at 25 knots or 30 knots, you really don't want to be out on the water. You want to be off the water if winds of that level are happening, unless you have significant skill and you just like to test yourself in that way. So these values would give me pause for going to pretty much any of these areas. Maybe I would think more kindly about Saanich Inlet, but I've had some experiences there too that have given me pause, so I'm not sure about that. Anyway, where would be the best place? And I ended up thinking, when I looked at all those numbers, that, well, the Gorge Waterway makes a lot of sense. It's going to be a nearby place, a place that's near a pullout. I'll be able to get on the water if that's what I really want to do. And it's going to be, a very short distance to the shore wherever I am. So that might be the answer for looking at the values that we just had here.
Can
And
I ask
Excuse
a
me.
question?
Yeah,
Alan?
go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, I can wait.
Hi, Alan. It's Ron Tanasichuk here. And
Yeah.
with the Nanaimo paddlers, it kind of, people tended to use the averages of the forecasts. And I made the point that if we're going to be safe on the water, we should actually go with the worst forecast that's there instead of kind of comparing them. And so, I mean, the ultimate thing is safety. So, I mean, and I used to use windy religiously, and then it just started falling apart. And I go with sail flow, and I look at least the 4 and the 10-day forecasts that come out of Spot WX. I like to look at the Spot WX forecast, the longer range ones, for consistency to see how they change. But the bottom line is, instead of comparing a bunch of different forecasts, I thought the safest thing to do is just to go with the worst one.
Yeah. Yes. Well, you certainly can't go wrong that way. Sometimes you feel like you can't paddle if you're going just with the worst case forecast. But it's a safe thing to do, Ron. I take that point. I do think that we should be very thoughtful about our skill level in relation to the forecasts we see, even on gusts. And I'll just mention, again, I think Tim was with me maybe a couple of weeks ago. We were in Saanich Inlet, and this was a little bit of a surprise, but we knew there were some strong winds. We weren't entirely sure where they would show up or when. But the winds were strong enough that we were on the far side, I guess, the west side of the inlet, making our way south toward intending to go to the falls there. And to get around a point, just a regular little point, was almost impossible. The wind was pushing you back almost as much as you could pull yourself forward or propel yourself forward. And you get used to the feeling of this, but the wind was whipping the white caps off the top of the white caps. It was spraying you with the spray from the white. Although they weren't big waves, they were probably 2 feet or something like that, but it was really fast. And so ultimately we gave up on that paddle plan and cut across away from the points, and it settled down. So around a point, you see that wind whipping thing happen more often. A point of land is an obstruction to the wind and to the water as well, and tends to create turbulence. And sometimes both will interact, and it really becomes, quite a slog to get around it. And the best thing is to just avoid that, or stop trying to beat Mother Nature, give up and go where she wants you to go, or will let you go. But fair point. Bear in mind worst case. I think the bottom line is we want to stay safe out there. Let's see if I had something else here I wanted to.
I just had a question how the flow and the ebb, because that's the piece that always is confusing for me.
Yeah.
First of all, about the speed, like what speed is worrisome if you're a beginner to intermediate paddler, and then how does the speed of the flood and the ebb, how does it impact? Because you've got wind and you've got, how does that impact your decision about tomorrow? Because you talked about the wind, how that would impact your decision about what to paddle, where to paddle tomorrow, or if to paddle.
I didn't. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I meant to do that. So that is the reason to understand what's happening with the current. Basically, if the current and the wind are opposed, then it raises the turbulence in the water. It shortens the wavelength, and it raises the wave height. It steepens the waves, if you want to put it that way. So if you have let's say a wind coming from the west, and you're in Juan de Fuca Strait, the wind is coming from the west, which typically it does. And at the same time, you have an ebb flow. So the ebb is coming out toward the west. Now, these two things are opposed. And that means there will be some disturbance in the water generally, because the wind and the current are kind of interacting in broad areas. But around points, like for instance, Albert Head, William Head, Beachy, any of the headlands, any of the big sort of features that stick out into the strait will interrupt that flow. And in this case, they're interrupting a flow that's already opposed. So it makes it even worse. You know, I talk about it being really gnarly, you know, kind of uncertain. It's hard to know what to do. It may be going every which way. And you can avoid that, which is sort of what I was talking about when we were in Saanich Inlet. You can avoid that particular problem by leaving, by getting out of the, away from the headland, paddle out into the water further. You know, it seems a bit counterintuitive. If you're feeling a little bit unstable, you might want to be closer to shore, but in fact, closer to headlands and shore features, it's worse. And if you get away from them, it settles down. It's not going to entirely settle down and become flat water, but it will be an easier job of paddling through it, and it'll be consistent. So I think one of the things you learn as you're picking up kayaking or any water skill like this that involves paddling is you develop a brace, you develop a rhythm, a stroke that's going to allow you to feel comfortable, feel in control. But the thing that sort of works against that is if something's constantly changing. If you take one stroke and suddenly you feel quite tippy on the side that you just took a stroke on, and then you adjust for that, and now you're tippy the other way because the water is quite turbulent. So one of the things that you, as a newer paddler, and certainly I remember this being terrified by that, is stay away from that water. I want to avoid that type of water altogether. I'm not a thrill seeker. I'm just trying to have a nice time out here, come back safe. So if I see some real turbulence, I'm going to avoid that. I'm going to go out further if I have to. And this applies in all situations. I've been around the whole island now, and I've been with people who are much better paddlers than I am. So often those paddlers will want to be in close to the shore. They love being close to the energy of the huge swells and breaking waves. I can do without that. So I go out, I'll paddle a mile offshore if that's where there's better water, because I really don't want to be in a situation where I feel, the world is suddenly tilting on me, and I'm not comfortable with the feeling that suggests. So I'm just wanting to say that to give the sense that I very much agree you want to be comfortable. And when you find that wind and current are opposed, when you see that in the prediction, if there's an ebb against a wind, you should expect that there will be some more turbulence in the water. And if you get to features like points or islands with sharp edges or reefs, those will exaggerate the sea state as well. So it would be a good idea then to try to avoid those, to find a paddle plan that takes you either well around them or avoids them altogether on a day when there is a higher wind.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, go ahead. If you're still on that point, go ahead.
Just around the speed, like a person who's not a very experienced paddler going out with friends would be not paddling when the speed was like 2 or more.
So 2 knots. Okay. For the current you're talking about, Suzanne?
Yes.
No, I would think, if you had a 2-knot current, that's not a particularly significant current, but you have to pay attention to it, obviously. The average paddler paddles between 2 and 3 knots. If you just, in a relaxed way, on an ongoing basis, paddled your kayak in flat water, you're going to go 2 or 3 knots. 2 or 3 nautical miles an hour. And so if you've got a current that is a little bit less than that, it means you can paddle against it if you had to. But typically what we do when we encounter current, when I encounter current, is I don't try to paddle up it, like going upstream a river. I try to cut across it. They call that ferry gliding. You're actually taking it on an angle one way or the other, and ideally using the power of the current to help you get where you want to go. So in that sense, a lighter current, I would say 2 knots is a fairly light current. even 3 knots. You could manage that. If it gets above that, you should be aware that's faster than you can paddle. So unless you're going with the current, you might want to avoid those places where the current is kind of channeled and becomes even stronger. But if the current is against a wind, then the turbulence comes into play. The sea state itself, the comfort you have with being bounced up and down, let's say, is more the issue than whether or not you're going to be able to overpower it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And Sindra, you had a question?
Well, I was going to see, my takeaway, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the fixed data comes from currents, tides, ebb and flows, and the topography, and the variable data is the wind that has an effect on all these fixed things. And that's what you should be paying attention to.
Yes, except you have to remember the whole thing is a dynamic system.
Right. So how far ahead can you, if we are given all these tables on ebb and flow, tides, currents, etc., those are quite far ahead.
Yeah.
We're given those. So you could plan for something quite far ahead,
Yes.
but the effect of the wind on it is what would change your mind either way. That's
Exactly.
what I'm saying.
Yes. No, you're quite right. Yeah.
Yeah. So the fixed things are the tides and the currents, and the topography, as you say, the slack tide being different depending on the topography under the water.
Mm-hmm.
And then the wind is what would change your ability to paddle against it or with it, or the
Exactly.
danger.
And the other fixed thing is the geography, if you like, right? The sort of features I've been mentioning, the headlands, the islands.
Right.
All of those things are, we know about them. And if we understand how they are affected by these, tides, currents, and potentially winds interacting with them, then we can somehow predict or forecast what we're likely to encounter. And then if in your forecast, and I take Ron's point, maybe take the worst case, okay, if it gets up to 15 knots and it goes around, I have to go around that headland, can I make it? Then you might want to reconsider your paddle plan and decide not to take that headland in or go a different place or, something like that.
Yeah. Does temperature have any bearing?
Not really. It does in terms of comfort, of course, and it certainly would in terms of if you went over, if you became immersed, even if you're wearing immersion gear, you're going to get cooler, and you're going to get cooler yet if it's, 0 degrees than if it's 10 or 20 degrees and so on. But generally the temperature is not a big feature, and nor is, sun, cloud, rain. Those are all things that are comfort level, but are not safety level issues for paddlers, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Alan, you never mentioned anything about launch sites and predicting that, because a lot of times that will depend on surf or the tides and that. Do you want to talk just a little bit about that?
About where you
would launch, well, where you go for lunch or something like that. Like sometimes you'll plan to go somewhere, and then if it's a high tide with a surf landing, you probably don't have the ability to get in for a lunch break, and then you have to replan. You have to kind of relook at your plan.
Yes,
I've been in paddles that has happened.
Yes, so that's right. If we are doing a day paddle in this area, typically it's a circuit of some kind, and I'll just, one that I think has been done recently, is a favorite paddle is to come out of Beecher Bay, out in Machosen. You come out around Beachy Head and down to Cabin Point. It's a beautiful paddle, rocky shoreline, not for beginners, I would say, but a very nice paddle, given good conditions, given adequate skill and so forth. However, even experienced paddlers, I've been with some, have been unable to land at Cabin Point if there's enough sort of wind driven wave action coming in on a high tide, because the tide might be coming right up to logs, which are stationary on the beach, and you're going to be coming off that water straight into a log. So how can you do that? You're going to be propelled by the force of a wind perhaps behind you. So yes, I agree with you, Jen. If you've got a paddle plan and it involves stopping somewhere, typically most of our plans do, you go for a couple of hours, stop, have a break, and then a couple of hours back or on, I suppose, on a one-way paddle, then you should think about your stopping point and whether or not it is going to be in the lee, whether it's going to be on a lee shore, a shore which is protected from whatever the prevailing wind might be, and whether it's likely to attract any kind of wind surf. I don't think we generally don't get swell surf here, like the big surf that you would have on Tofino beaches and so forth, and that's a whole other topic. But we do get 2-3 foot waves, and honestly, a 1 foot wave is enough to tip you over if you're not careful. There's a lot of power in the water. So as you come into a beach, and you should pay close attention, then the shape of the beach, the extent of the beach, the obstructions on the beach, and the type of water that you're dealing with are very important. The paddle, just as an example, last week, I do Thursday paddle. So Tim is often on these Thursday paddles. So last week, our one-way paddle, we were going around the top of the peninsula I mentioned. We stopped on Piers Island. I don't know if you know Piers Island, but they have a kind of a community park on the, I guess it's northwest-facing shore of Piers Island. And it's got a nice kind of gravel beach that's quite easily landed at any tide. It's big beach. And we knew that there was a place at the top we could sit. It's also out of the wind because that was a southeasterly wind day. And we knew that initially the wind would be behind us, which is nice to have. It gives you a little more propulsion than you might have otherwise. And we came around those islands above Swartz Bay, and that was fine too. Coming into Piers, to that beach, there was almost no wind because we were kind of really protected. The difficulty there is you have to keep in mind, that wind is still out there. I can see further out in the ocean, that wind is still blowing. When we turn into it, we're going to feel it. And sure enough, when we came across and made a turn into Saanich Inlet, there was the wind, and it increased and increased as we approached our final place, which was Pat Bay. So, not only the intermediate, the sort of lunch spot, but also your landing spot, if it's different from where you started, especially. I should give some thought to that. That too, the tide level combined with the landing is why many of us, when there are high tides, start to think about ramps. And sometimes you pay for the use of these. For instance, at Pedder Bay Marina, where you pay to park $10 a car, or at Chiana Marina, which is now up to $10 a kayak. But they have ramps. And the great thing about ramps is, it sort of doesn't matter what the tide's doing. You're going to be able to get in and out. It's usually very protected for the boaters, so the wind has died away. And you've mostly just got a convenient way to get into the water. Typically, we think about beaches because we like to have an area where we can set out our kayaks beside each other and get all our stuff organized. And ramps don't offer that, but they are very useful if there are high tides going on. And if there's a very low tide too, sometimes those beaches are really slippery. And so rather than, stumbling over a lot of slippery rocks, a ramp is a nice option. Tulista has a ramp, which is free to use. There's some other ramps around as well. So another thought there.
Hey, Alan, can I ask another question, please?
Yeah.
I think Sindra, I hope I said your name properly, made an excellent point about, some of the parameters being fixed and others not being fixed.
Yeah.
I'm trying to transfer what I've learned, of kayaking further up with everybody in Nanaimo to the new group here. And we basically called trips when it was the winds were 10 knots or more. Do you guys have kind of a threshold for wind?
So our club categorizes paddles as either relaxed or energizer. And there are a whole series of considerations for what paddle falls into what category. Ultimately, we give the trip leader, the paddle leader on that trip, the authority to make whatever decision he or she feels is the right decision based on the conditions that they perceive or that they see or whatever. So they're the ones in charge. But we do have some guidelines, and we would consider light winds to be 5 to 10 knots or up to 10 knots. Those would be light winds, and up to 15 knots would be moderate winds. So we would have energizer paddles that would go out in winds up to 15 knots. I think what you want to, as a paddle leader, be aware of is beyond the actual number is, what's that level of wind going to do in the body of water I'm in. I mentioned before the experience I had with swell coming into Telegraph Cove of all places, which is usually quite protected. But that was a strong wind, a 20-knot wind had been blowing all night from the east, and it created a very large set of waves that were really like ocean swells coming in. And so it wasn't particularly safe, so we didn't go. But that would be something to bear in mind, even though the wind when we went in the morning was about 5 knots. There was no wind, it had stopped, but the wind was still having an effect by virtue of the swell that was coming in. And there was current. If you know Telegraph Cove, you're near Baines Channel, which is a famously turbulent channel. So that was our plan. We'll go down to Baines Channel, we'll take a look, maybe we'll go over to Discovery. None of that happened. We were pretty easily convinced by a short paddle out and back that this was not a day we should be on the water. But just to make the point that it depends, and here I'm not just talking about club paddles, but about any of you having a paddle on your own or whatever with friends. If you had a high skill level, you might see that same set of conditions and say, that's where I want to be. And we had the experience of at that day, we just kind of came back in after like 10 minutes and said, okay, let's go for coffee. But before we go for coffee, let's go down to Smuggler's Cove, which is right near 10 Mile Point, and see what it looks like. It must be awesome to see what's happening out on Baines. So we pulled around to Smuggler's Cove, and you could see out there, there's a lot of rough water, white water. And there was a fellow in a car with a kayak on it, sitting there. And we thought, whoa, he may not know that it's pretty bad out there. Let's just let him know. And so we knocked on his window and said, oh, hi, I don't know if you know, but we just came from Telegraph Cove. We were out very briefly, and it's wild out there. It's really bad. And he said, yes, I know. That's why I am here. And this was Nick Castro. I don't know if any of you know Nick Castro. He is an expert paddler. And he would go out in that with great pleasure. And he was just waiting for another friend to come along. And then they were going to charge out there and see just how bad it was, And I recognized him and I thought, oh, yeah, that'll be fine for you. But it was not at all fine for us. So it depends your skill level and what you want. It's not my style of paddling. So we've covered a few things here. I don't know if I've raised more questions than I've answered, but we haven't heard from a lot of people. Are there any other questions you have or experiences you've had that you'd like to share about trying to figure out wind and weather interacting with tides and currents? No? Okay.
Are you going to be giving us, did you say you would be providing a sheet?
Yes.
All of those
yes.
websites on them?
Yeah, so I think what I can do, I'm going to try to do this. And if not, I can just send it to you afterwards, but I'll see if I can use the chat.
Okay.
Let's see. And I'm going to go to everyone in the meeting. And I'm going to attach.
And is that something we can access later on from the chat? Or is it just...
You should be able to pick it off now. And then what I think I'll do, because I've got access through the website where you signed up to everyone. So I'll just send it out to everyone anyway, but I'm curious to see if I can do this. Yeah, this is it. A PDF, that should be something everybody can see.
Yeah.
Can you see that in the chat?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And so you should be able to pick that off, and it has a lot of the website URLs that I've mentioned. The other thing, just to emphasize again, is because it's kind of mind-boggling, this stuff. My wife tells me I'm a real weather nerd because I'm always looking at this stuff, but I still don't really understand it. But I think I've gotten to a point where I have a system that I try to follow every time I'm in trying to plan a paddle so that I have a basic level of knowledge. And I'll say that most of the time it does work out, that what I think is going to happen does happen. But I'll also be very frank with you. I've had a number of situations where it has not worked out. And I have hit much more weather and wind, sea state than I could handle. And have had to, sort of take the nearest exit and not continue to paddle. So I've never had any bad experiences on the water, but I've certainly been surprised by things that happen.
Have you ever gone back to find out why you were surprised or to learn from it or?
Yeah.
Mhm.
I have. One situation was, and it's in Saanich Inlet. So there was another person I was speaking to recently. I don't think she's on the call here, but we were talking about, Saanich Inlet, quite a protected place. And she said, well, yes, it is. But when it gets windy, it can be terrible. And I agree. I've been on Saanich Inlet, and we had gone from Brentwood Bay up to the north and then across to Mill Bay and down to Bamberton. And now we were making our way back across to Brentwood Bay. And the wind had risen while we were out. We were aware it was rising. We were aware it would rise, but we weren't aware how much it would rise. And honestly, to come back across was a real, we call them a slog, was just, you had to really work and work and work. And one of our friends was unable to really go straight, just couldn't control the kayak to go straight. So while most of us made for Brentwood Bay, we started it near the ferry there. This person ended up further north because the wind was blowing from the south and it just took them. And so somebody else went with them and helped them. So that was good. We knew that was all happening. Good to be communicating with your radios and so on and be aware. But it shows you that, and that person was a strong paddler, but just unable to counteract the effect of the wind in that situation. So just something to bear in mind that, the reality is sometimes not, you can't really predict what it's going to be or how everybody in your group is going to react to it.
Right.
And it's best to be, Ron was saying, take the worst case is probably a solid suggestion. Would I be able to handle that? The other thing is, if you're in a group, can the least skilled paddler manage this? And because if they can't, what are the options? Are we all going to be able to get off safely somewhere? Can we tow them? Which is a good idea, by the way. And even though some people feel reluctant to be towed, it's helpful. For instance, with the person I mentioned, just a tow to keep them pointed in the right direction would have been helpful further on, might have made it an easier paddle for them. Can they be towed? Or, you don't want a worst case scenario where somebody is exhausted and can't continue or falls out of their kayak or whatever. So, make sure that the least capable paddler is up to whatever it is you have planned, or that you have alternatives along the way, I guess.
Alan, I think you make a really good point to know when to call it and get off the water. I was on a paddle a few years back with Mike Teachman, and he called it, which was very wise. And we ended up actually going into Canoe Cove and walking to get our cars at Amherst Avenue. But it was the right call because the winds just kind of picked up all of a sudden. And it was the first time, like when I was paddling in the West Coast, that I really saw how quickly the winds could pick up. Like we started off, it was beautiful, it was calm. And within probably an hour and a half, it was like crazy winds and waves and everything. And I think it was the right thing. But a lot of times people don't want to call the paddle. They want to just paddle through it.
Yep.
And I think that sometimes it's best just to call it.
Oh, I agree. And just out of curiosity, Jenny, and that one, were you coming from the north at the time that you pulled in?
We were actually supposed to go out to Rum Island, which was really good that we didn't go all the way out there.
That's good.
But we were around Coal Island when we were coming across over in that little strait.
Yep.
and we were trying to get back down to Amherst around the corner there. We just could not get around. It was just wild. And so we just decided to back up and go into Canoe Cove, and yeah. It was kind of interesting. We all got our exercise, but just not from kayaking. It was walking to get our cars.
Yeah, there's no shame in taking a taxi. I've done that as well.
Well, we were in the middle of COVID, so none of us wanted to take a taxi.
Okay. And that area, I have to say, you would have had to cross the mouth of Roberts Bay to go from Canoe Cove down to Amherst. And I had a particularly bad experience with some friends in that area. And one of the reasons was, I'm not sure about the wind you were facing, but in my case, it was a westerly wind, southwesterly wind. And we knew it was coming up very strongly, but we thought it was going to be a bit later. And we were coming, well, we'd passed Canoe Cove and we began across Roberts Bay. What I didn't understand at the time, and somebody, Don Tunstall, who lives in Roberts Bay, told me later, oh yeah, whenever there's a strong westerly, southwesterly wind, it blows out of the bay, kind of finds some channel on the land and blows out of the bay. So we were cutting across Roberts Bay and it was wild, as you mentioned, but we didn't do exactly what you did. It sounds like you did the right thing. Our group, a couple of people just decided they'd go into Seam Harbor. One person just carried on, very skilled paddler, and got back to Amherst. I was with another fellow and he capsized. And then in that situation, I realized, because the wind waves going on were about 3 to 4 feet high, and it was quite steep, like they were quite close together. It was very pitchy, tossy kind of, and that's what had knocked him over, a surprise, kind of couple of waves together. Because he's a good paddler, but I couldn't rescue him. I mean, I felt pretty confident with my own paddling. I didn't feel in danger myself, but I didn't have the skill to get him back on board. So that was a search and rescue call. And actually, he was picked up by a boat that heard the call and turned and picked him up. But it shows you that can happen. We were probably about 300 meters from land. We weren't very far away, but it was blowing us out to sea. It was blowing us away from the land, and we couldn't overcome it. And we heard later from the fellows who went into Seam Harbor that they were talking to mariners who have, wind meters on their rigging and stuff. And they said, oh, the wind has been up to 37 knots. It's running at least 30 knots all the time. And we're like, oh, that's not good. We can't paddle in that kind of, but we had no idea it had sort of built up and caught us out in the open going across Roberts Bay. So that's even though it's near, that can be a dangerous area given very strong winds. So I agree, Mike made a good call, and you got some walking exercise. That's good too. Any other comments? Any other true confessions? Feel free. I think if you paddle on the shorelines around Victoria, you will have sometimes when you are surprised. And I guess just to kind of wrap things up, you want to know enough to not get yourself into the situations that you can't handle, and you and your friends. And of course, we try to do that with club paddles for everybody. But by the same token, it could happen. And that's why we practice rescues. That's why we practice and expect people to be dressed for immersion. And because in a bad situation, you want to be able still to get to shore somehow and not necessarily have a tragedy occur. I'm happy to say we've never had something like that, but we certainly don't want to have anything occur with anybody in our group here who is paying attention to good practice. So that's about all I think we can say about that. And I certainly, having said that, if you aren't aware, this is one of probably a very few best places in the world, I'm not kidding, to paddle. It's not the temperature of the water that distinguishes us here, because it's rather cold. It's the nature of the landforms and the fact that we have so many options with the Big Island, Vancouver Island, all the smaller islands, all the fjords. and up the coast, there are very few places in the world that offer the range of experiences we have here. So for somebody who's just starting out, you can have a flat water paddle experience, often not too far away. And if somebody wants that, like Nick Castro, that death-defying experience in big weather, you can find that too. So as you grow into the sport, you will find what works for you. I'm not going to set any records here, but wish you well, and I hope that you have a good time paddling. I don't suggest you use tomorrow as a paddling day, but I'm hoping that Wednesday is much better, and Thursday too. Anyway, thanks everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Yeah. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan.
Oh, you're most welcome.
Thanks, Alan.